The deployment of troops in Ukraine has always been a sensitive issue. This sensitive issue has been put back on the table with the increasing aggressiveness of the Russian military, Putin's constant invocation of the nuclear weapons trump card, and his cooperation on the front line with North Korea has led NATO to take more precautions. Putin was cunning enough to intimidate NATO with the nuclear weapon card, daring enough to cooperate with North Korea, and nervous enough to know that his military would be ineffective against a united NATO force. The crossing of Putin's red lines has shown that his threats have not materialized. NATO experienced this realization by lifting the restrictions on Storm Shadow and ATAC Massachusetts missiles. Moreover, Russia's cooperation with North Korea opened a new door of opportunity for NATO. Although North Korean troops were stationed on Russian territory, they were fighting on the front line against Ukraine. If Russia could get military support to defend its territory, wouldn't it be fair for Ukraine to do the same? This reopened the option of deploying a combined NATO force to Ukraine to end the war. Sending troops to Ukraine had always been one of the UK and France's peace options. Now, the UK and France had reason to say enough is enough with North Korea and Russia's cooperation. After the Storm Shadow AACMS moves, the UK and France have accelerated their efforts to send troops or personnel to Ukraine. But will Russia's continued war with North Korea against Ukraine lead NATO members France and the UK to send troops to Kiev? If the two NATO members send troops to the war, what kind of a dilemma will Putin face? What kind of deterrent measures will the UK and France, as well as the US and other alliance members, use to end the war in Ukraine? We will now examine all these questions. The British and French governments have reportedly revived discussions about deploying Western troops to protect Ukraine from further Russian aggression. Russia's ambassador to the United Kingdom, Andrei Kellen, offered important assessments on whether it would not be wrong to have UK troops in Ukraine, referring to the decision to lift restrictions on the use of Storm Shadow missiles. French leader Emmanuel Macron has been one of the most prominent supporters of sending troops to Ukraine. French Foreign Minister Jean-Noël Barrot emphasized that they are not ruling out any option. The French armed forces, especially within the military, have become increasingly bold about the role that the country's military personnel could play in Ukraine, especially after the end of hostilities. The plans of the United Kingdom and France to send troops to Ukraine were enough to seriously alarm the Kremlin. The Kremlin leadership characterized such a move as faible, but this move was also supported by the new US President Donald Trump. Donald Trump has promised to end the war in Ukraine, and the outlines of his plan are beginning to emerge. The US leader probably took into account Russia's military cooperation with North Korea and considered it wrong that tens of thousands of North Korean troops, which Pyongyang had put at Putin's disposal, were participating in the fighting in KSK and on other fronts. The United Kingdom and France were also opposed to North Korean troops fighting for Russia against Ukraine. One of the most vocal supporters of the idea of the UK and France sending troops to Ukraine in recent days has been former Prime Minister Boris Johnson. Boris Johnson said that British troops should be sent to protect Ukraine's borders in the event of a future ceasefire with Russia. The former Prime Minister emphasized that the responsibility for keeping any agreement intact should fall on European peacekeepers. Boris Johnson added that Western countries must prevent Russia from rearming and launching another attack on Ukraine in the future by making clear what security guarantees would be offered. Johnson's proposal is likely to ensure that NATO's Article 5, which states that an attack on one member is considered an attack on all members, would be triggered if Western troops serving in a UN peacekeeping force were attacked. The former Prime Minister has therefore called for Ukraine to become a NATO member as soon as possible, as this would be the only solution in the long term. According to experts, the NATO troops Boris Johnson is referring to do not necessarily enter Ukraine to aggressively confront Russian forces. These additional NATO troops could create a security bubble over a significant part of Ukraine that is not occupied by Russia. According to analysts, this would significantly strengthen Ukraine's chances of ending the war on its own terms. And such a presence is inevitably necessary for stabilization once the conflict ends. The only way to convince Russian President Vladimir Putin that Ukraine's sovereignty and independence are no longer vulnerable to his revisionist hegemonic ambitions is seen as a concrete security guarantee evidenced by a military presence on the ground. While a NATO mission to Ukraine and NATO membership would have the maximum effect, a strong transatlantic coalition of the willing would be sufficient and could help achieve the former. Europe could provide the bulk of such a force, however. Experts believe that Putin will not be persuaded unless the United States also gets involved by providing the necessary enabling capacity such as intelligence, air cover, air defense, and long-range strikes. But what does the US think about this? The new US administration led by Trump is in fact committed to ending the war in Ukraine. Brian Lanza, who has served as Trump's political advisor since his 2016 presidential campaign, has stated that the new US administration's priority for Ukraine will be peace rather than helping Russia regain territory it has seized in its nearly 3-year war. Following the statement, Trump's team talked about freezing the war in place, not opposing Russia's seizure of around 20% of Ukraine, and forcing Ukraine to temporarily suspend its quest to join the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. A previously unreported idea proposed in Trump's transition office, detailed by 3 people close to the president-elect, would involve Kyiv pledging not to join NATO for at least 20 years. In return, it was assumed the United States would continue to flood Ukraine with weapons to deter a future Russian attack aimed at destabilizing the peace. Under this plan, the front line would essentially be locked down, and both sides would agree to an 800 m demilitarized zone. It remains unclear who would oversee the zone, but a Trump advisor said the peacekeeping force would not include American troops or come from a US-funded international organization such as the United Nations. Trump's advisor emphasized that the Poles, Germans, British, and French should take on the task of protecting the demilitarized zone. This is where the UK and French troops in particular would come in. In some ways, this proposal echoed comments made by Vice President-elect J.D. Vance in an interview in September. Vance suggested that a final agreement to end the war could include a heavily fortified demilitarized zone to prevent the Russians from invading Ukraine again. Vance also said that Russia would retain the territories it had captured and ensure Ukraine's neutrality. The fact that the Trump administration was moving forward with a similar plan raised the possibility that the war between Russia and Ukraine could end with Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhzhia, and Kherson under Moscow's rule. So, what does Russia want to end the war? Russian Security Council Secretary Sergei Shoigu said that the West should recognize that Russia won the war in Ukraine and negotiate to end it. Shoigu, an ally of President Vladimir Putin and defense minister since 2012 until Putin dismissed him in May, also stressed that the West tried to use Ukraine to inflict a strategic defeat on Russia, but failed. According to Shoigu, Ukraine must give up its NATO ambitions and withdraw its troops from all 4 regions claimed by Moscow. Still, one of Putin's closest aides, Shoigu's statements will probably not be accepted by the Ukrainian government. In fact, this is what Kremlin leader Vladimir Putin wanted. Putin wanted a certain part of Ukraine to remain occupied by Russia and Crimea to be under his control. But these demands of the Russian leadership forced the NATO alliance to take tougher steps. Germany, for example, has recently taken a very important step against Russia's demands for an end to the war. The Berlin government has revealed that it has begun making plans on how it can help deploy some 800,000 NATO troops, including Americans, to Ukraine as Russia's nuclear saber-rattling reaches new heights. The plan, called Operation Deutschland, runs to 1,000 pages, according to German media sources. The top-secret documents on the plan reportedly detail specific buildings and infrastructure that need to be protected so they can be used by the military and how businesses and civilians should prepare in case of increased threats. The documents also say that Berlin is preparing a way to push 200,000 military vehicles onto German soil in case the alliance needs to join Ukraine's efforts. In the operational plan, Germany also advises citizens on ways to prepare for the worst by increasing their self-sufficiency through mechanisms including installing diesel generators and even wind turbines. Sweden and Norway have also recently published brochures and literature instructing their citizens on how to prepare in case the Ukrainian conflict spills over into their countries. These precautionary moves signaled NATO's acceptance of the Operation Deutschland plan. Although Berlin has been criticized for its perceived hesitancy to support Ukraine's war since 2022, German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock claimed in a statement that the country did not fear Putin's nuclear policy change. Following these statements, Operation Deutschland was characterized as a retaliatory step against Putin's change of nuclear doctrine. Putin stated that the nuclear mission was being expanded and outlined numerous changes from the previous 2020 doctrine. Putin then approved changes to Russia's nuclear doctrine, specifying the conditions under which the country will consider using its own arsenal. The doctrine now says that an attack by a non-nuclear state will be considered a joint attack on Russia if supported by a nuclear power. The update was proposed in September and approved on Tuesday, the 1,000th day of the war with Ukraine. Under the amendments, A major attack on Russia by conventional missiles, drones, or aircraft would also meet the criteria for a nuclear response to any critical threat to Belarus or Russian sovereignty. Any attack on Russia by a coalition member state would be perceived by Moscow as an attack by the entire group. The updates increase the number of countries and coalitions that could be subject to a possible nuclear response and the types of military threats, state news agency T reported. Putin has previously threatened to use nuclear weapons, which Ukraine criticized as nuclear saber-rattling to prevent allies from providing more support. However, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said Russia was in favor of making every effort to prevent a nuclear war. Speaking at a press conference on the sidelines of the G20 summit in Rio de Janeiro, Lavrov made it clear that the declaration signed by the grouping, which includes Russia, is about moving towards a world free of nuclear weapons. In this regard, Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said that the text of the nuclear doctrine is very important and requires deep analysis. Since its illegal invasion of Ukraine on February 24, 2022, Russia has tried to implement its playbook of nuclear threats in Ukraine. An expert study earlier this year found more than 200 cases in which Russian leaders referred to nuclear weapons in the context of the war in Ukraine. As the conflict on the ground has escalated, so have Russian nuclear threats. In the last 6 months alone, Russia has conducted military exercises with Belarus involving tactical nuclear weapons and, in an unprecedented move, publicized the exercises to the Russian public. Russia also withdrew its ratification of the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty in 2023, and Ryakov revealed earlier this month that Russia is fully prepared to resume testing if necessary. With such moves, Russia was normalizing a dangerous nuclear discourse. International reactions to Russia's nuclear saber-rattling have been mixed. While the leaders of China and India were thought to be pressuring Putin to refrain from escalation and potential nuclear use in October 2022, many states were conflicted about publicly condemning Russia's actions and threats. Many countries in the global south widely condemned the nuclear escalations without explicitly calling out Russia for its alliances with Moscow. Since the obvious reactions were not severe, it became possible for Russia to believe that it could continue to make nuclear threats with minimal consequences. The new doctrine held third-party states responsible for supporting conventional attacks against Russia, even if they were not the perpetrators of the attacks. The updated version of the document proposed that aggression against Russia by any non-nuclear weapon state, but with the participation or support of a nuclear weapon state, should be considered a joint attack against the Russian Federation. Putin said this amendment seems to explicitly target NATO members that have armed Ukraine in the ongoing war. Russia's previous nuclear doctrine, on the other hand, said that nuclear weapons could be used if there was data confirming an incoming ballistic missile attack. The new version also expands the nature of incoming attacks that could warrant nuclear use to include airstrikes such as aircraft missiles and drones. This seems clearly tailored to the ongoing war in Ukraine and an attempt to increase the risks for NATO members supporting Ukraine. The most important takeaway from these changes in Russian doctrine is that they target NATO in the context of Ukraine and signal that the conditions for Russia to use nuclear weapons are expanding and that it is more willing to escalate the ongoing war. In sum, Russia's threatening pressure environment and its nuclear games trigger the idea of NATO's deployment of troops to Ukraine and pave the way for urgent action by the United Kingdom and France. At the same time, Russia's behavior is reigniting the debate on Ukraine's NATO membership. We will see more clearly NATO's reactions, security measures, and whether it will send troops to Ukraine or not. But if Russia continues with its nuclear threats and its dangerous cooperation with North Korea, NATO is likely to take much more decisive steps in the future to send troops to Ukraine. Thank you for tuning in. The ongoing conflict in Ukraine, coupled with the evolving nuclear doctrine of Russia, underscores a harsh reality: the fragility of global peace and the importance of robust international cooperation. From the escalation of nuclear threats to the deepening complexities of alliances, this war has provided critical lessons for nations and individuals alike. The importance of diplomacy over escalation. One significant takeaway is the dire need for diplomacy to prevail over aggression. The persistent nuclear saber-rattling from Russia not only destabilizes the region, but also risks a chain reaction that could involve other global powers. Diplomatic engagement, even with adversaries, remains the most viable route to ensuring long-term peace. It is crucial for leaders to prioritize dialogue over threats and find common ground that safeguards sovereignty and international stability. Global unity against aggression. The unified stance of NATO and other allies demonstrates the strength of collective security. However, it also highlights the necessity of a balanced approach. While military support for Ukraine is essential in defending its sovereignty, nations must also address the long-term implications of an arms race and avoid actions that might provoke unnecessary escalations. The balance between deterrence and resolution is delicate and requires careful calibration. Humanitarian consequences and the cost of war. Beyond the strategic and political implications, this war serves as a stark reminder of the devastating humanitarian toll conflicts impose. Thousands of lives have been lost, millions displaced, and entire communities left in ruins. Nations and global organizations must place greater emphasis on addressing the human cost of war by providing aid, rebuilding efforts, and supporting victims of conflict. The human dimension should never be overshadowed by geopolitical considerations. Personal reflections. As observers of these events, it is easy to feel overwhelmed by the magnitude of the conflict. However, it is also a reminder of our shared responsibility to advocate for peace and justice. Leaders are accountable to their people and the broader global community, but individuals also play a role by raising awareness, supporting humanitarian efforts, and fostering a culture of dialogue over division. It is imperative to recognize that security and peace are not achieved through isolation or aggression, but through cooperation, respect for international law, and mutual understanding. The lessons of this conflict should encourage the global community to strengthen institutions that uphold peace and address grievances before they escalate into war. Looking forward. The situation in Ukraine and the broader implications of Russia's nuclear doctrine highlight the need for vigilance and preparedness among nations. The international community must work towards frameworks that prevent the misuse of power and ensure accountability for actions that threaten global stability. At the same time, countries must support Ukraine's sovereignty without compromising the broader goal of long-term peace. In conclusion, while the world grapples with these challenges, it is crucial to remember that lasting solutions lie in collective effort and a commitment to humanity's shared future. The decisions made today will shape the security and stability of tomorrow, making it more important than ever for nations and individuals to choose unity over division and peace over conflict.